Thank you very much. And again, we're extremely grateful as a faculty to the college for hosting tonight. We're looking forward to the dinner as well. As the head of the faculty, it's also extremely exciting to actually be able to introduce one of my own colleagues from the Department of Archaeology. And John's title, Persons, Hierarchies, Urban Growth in Balkan Prehistory, is indicative of really his research trajectory, where he's managed to balance the role of both active field worker and also academic, and very much driving on the formative years, because I happened to go through his file this morning, from the Institute of Archaeology as an undergraduate and through into as a PhD student. Those of you who know John will know that then he went into the regional museum sector in the UK for about 4 years after finishing his PhD, and he joined the University of Newcastle in 1980 as a lecturer. He then moved across to Durham, where he is now, in 96, and then in 2012 he was recognised and awarded a personal chair. And as I mentioned, John has been an absolutely dedicated field worker, and he has led, I don't know if I can say it, generations of undergraduates and postgraduates into the field in the Balkans, with projects in Hungary, the Forests of Stones project in Bulgaria, and then most recently the major megasites project in Ukraine. But I suppose what's most interesting when you look at John's profile is the way he's balanced that field work and the production of the monographs alongside the more exploratory work, particularly within materiality, and the work on fragmentation, which has gained a sort of an international scope and impact. And one of the advantages of being in my office with all the files around it is you can also look up people's referees' comments for when they are nominated for chair. And one of his external referees, a fellow of the British Academy, attributed him the honour of creating a new sub-discipline in fragmentation, quote unquote, identifying that breaking objects and broken objects themselves may influence the creation and maintenance of social relationships, and I hope we'll hear a little more about that. I should also note, at a time when the institution is gearing up for REF and focusing on our activities and the alignment against the university targets and aspirations, that John is one of the most successful grant award holders within the department, having been awarded one of the largest AHRC grants within the history of the university, over 700,000 for the Early Urbanism in Europe project, and also at the same time being successful with almost 200k through an EU Marie Curie, demonstrating some real success within that. Both awards are real success in terms of focus and also are testament to John's standing within the wider archaeological community. Externally, he's also performed academic service. He was first editor of the Journal of European Archaeology, and then recently has stepped down as being a vice president of the Prehistoric Society, and is also an honorary member of the Bulgarian Academy of Science, their Institute of Archaeology. So both national and international recognition. So it's absolutely a delight for me to now introduce Professor John Chapman to deliver his inaugural lecture, Persons, Hierarchies and Urban Growth in Balkan Prehistory. John.
Thank you very much. Well, Professor Cunningham, Adrian, friends and colleagues, it's a great pleasure to be invited to Josephine Butler College to give this lecture, and up to 3 weeks ago it seemed possible that I would be attempting to give an inaugural that was going to be postponed through snowfall, not once but twice, but in fact things are better now. That's a delight that it's actually happened. I'm going to start off with a few personal details about how I came into the Balkans, and the story started in fact in Greece when my parents took me around Minoan and Mycenaean sites, and inspired by this and by a field excavation season at the Palace of Knossos in the Neolithic levels with my first professor, John Evans from London, I thought this would be wonderful to try to work in Greek prehistory. So I naively sent off letters to many Greek museums with making 3 mistakes in a single letter. That's to say, suggesting we could do some work together on archaeological material in the summer. Fatal mistake. After receiving 1 reply out of 25 in this sense, I thought it was time to move on and try somewhere else. I toyed for a while with the idea of working in Northwest Europe until a fellow student who'd been on an excavation in Ireland told me how they'd learnt to drink beer to keep warm. And at this point I thought, let's try further south again. And indeed that led me to the Danube Basin, and slightly later that wonderful Hungarian stroke Ukrainian stroke Serbian river, the Tisa, which a 16th century antiquarian described as comprising 2/3 water, 1/3 fish. Wonderful, wonderful river. A bit later on, for the historian Cioran, the Danube Basin had turned into an amalgam of vital but obscure peoples, ignorant of history, the womb of a culture not yet devitalized by rationalism or progress. And indeed it was this vitality and hospitality also which led me to come to love the Danube Basin and work in that area. It's an area then on the edge of old Europe which may have consumed more history than it has produced, but at the same time it's an area which is a mediator between cultures. And so this sort of twin theme of consuming history but being a mediator at the same time is something I might touch on and take from the present into the deeper past. So having fixed on an area that seemed to me to be interesting, a regional area with immense potential, in a sense then I had to decide that I wouldn't take on some of the grand narratives of world history, if you like, the ascent of man, with apologies to Jakob Bronowski here and others, but instead look at this regional perspective, but at the same time bearing in mind those very insightful words of Andrew Sherratt back in 1981, suggesting then that archaeologists need a logarithmic imagination, so moving then from the very smallest detail of evidence right up to the continental level, as portrayed in this wonderful graph map that Andrew prepared, which goes from continental Europe in stages of 10, reduction, an increase in scale of 10, right down to the individual panoramic house. A wonderful inspirational diagram, that. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at then. So very briefly, I'd like to introduce some aspects of later Balkan prehistory and talk about a few themes that I've been interested over the years: personhood, how people become people, if you like, and look at some surprising evidence in a way for trans-European exchange networks which are vast, well before the Bronze Age, and this is not widely appreciated. And then look at some spectacular mortuary evidence from the Varna Cemetery before returning to the project which Robin so kindly mentioned, this project about megasites to see if Europe's first cities, proto-cities, have something to tell us about European developments. So that's where we're going to go and then sum up. And because it's that topic in the IAS, I'll just start then with looking very briefly at some sort of overall dates then. These are dates BC, with some late foragers still going on, early farmers starting off in the 7th millennium now, mature farmers, people who've settled down and know what they're doing about farming a little later. And then this amazing climax period, which is a climax in all kinds of senses, perhaps demographic, but certainly material, certainly economic. And then there's this post-climax Copper Age phase of decreasing intensification and much smaller settlement scale. So there's a sort of broad chronological phase, just so you can put this all in context. So if we look at some of the artifacts then, this is very much about things, it's about materials, again, Robin kindly mentioned. It's also about names. There are a large number of cultural names here, which I won't expect you to memorize unless you really want to. But these early farmers then have got regional similarities and also ceramic differences. They often make small figurines, anthropomorphic figurines of fired clay, but they can also make absolutely wonderful life-size pig figurines, like this one here, and exquisite figurines of red deer as well, about this big. So it's wonderful material there, extremely rich, found mostly in settlement contexts, unlike what we're perhaps used to in Britain. A little bit later then, in the mature farming period, lots of new names to remember, longer occupations, tell sites, echoing developments in the Near East perhaps, and huge numbers of these little anthropomorphic figurines, which have many types, pentagonal faces, resembling students who sat through a 2-hour lecture on Balkan prehistory, animal-human combinations, and famous ones that appear in fine art coffee table books like The Thinkers from the shores of the Black Sea. A bit later then, in the climax Copper Age, and you'll see this map again later, the diversity of figures increases with material in gold, in bone, in copper, and in shell, as well as fired clay. Some of the gold ones that we'll come back to in Varna a little later. And we also see for the first time images on cave walls dated to this period. Like there, sometimes quite complex. Mother and child figurines. Sickle gods, which are in fact not sickle gods at all because they're hermaphrodites. Let's not worry about that. Increasingly sets of figurines that suggest complex arrangements in shrines, perhaps public. There's a very interesting set there from Eastern Europe. And herds as well. So we've got a vast array then of material relating to everyday life and what's happening at this period. And a lot of this disappears in the post-climax Copper Age, when we're looking at really rather small sets of figurines, some decorated pottery, but not a great deal, but a great emphasis on metal. Sometimes fine examples of bird figurines. So that gives you a sort of visual basis then for what's going on in the Balkans over a period of about 3,000 years. Okay. So what of personhood? How can we study this? And this is obviously one of the smaller scale topics to touch on. I suggest then that there might be 3 ways that we could understand how a person becomes a person. One of them relates to gender and age, and we can look at what happened to anthropomorphic figurines, which are often deliberately broken, again, as we've heard. There's another field, though, that's just really starting to develop, which is the new kinds of people who are emerging at this time. New personal skills are being developed, both at the start of farming and also when we have an intensification of copper and gold metallurgy. And there's another way we can look at how people become people, and that's through personal ornaments, which are often at the same time status objects. So if we have a look at these three, we'll see where we're going. And underpinning the last one is this very important aesthetic of colour, brilliance and exoticity, which we'll see carrying on right throughout this talk. Pause for effect. Can you see that at the back? That's right then. Just as well. That's good. We've noticed that with certain bodies of material, certain kinds of figurines, they're made in a very particular way, particular style, with very strongly gendered parts to the figurines. And this particular group isn't made, by and large, with heads or with faces. There's simply a neck. But in fact, apart from the bits of this figurine which are rather obviously female, one could argue that the neck of this figurine type is a phallic neck, which then produces a rather different configuration. And if, as happened on settlement sites a great deal, this hermaphrodite with male and female parts was deliberately broken, then the breaking of the figurine creates a change in gender. So you have female parts and male parts. And these were used, we suppose, to negotiate questions of gender in these small-scale settlements. And at the end of people's lives, often the complete figurine, the male with both male and female parts, was buried with the person. So there's this cycle from complete hermaphrodite to parts with different genders, and then back to complete hermaphrodite status. And that's one way you can be a person then in the East Balkans. But there's another way, which is simply to stay the same sex all the time, not really change, just lose bits of the body. And this deliberate fragmentation then might take different stages. There's one. Oh, there's another bit. Oh dear, there's not much left there. But that's the kind of process in which there is this stable gender, which perhaps changes with age, through time, but it's a fundamentally different way of creating persons. And we've checked then through the ways that figurines have been produced in the Balkan Neolithic and Copper Age, and these two styles of creating persons have a very different sort of distribution in time and space. So that's quite an interesting finding, I think. So that's a little bit about fragmentation. But another thing that's happening at the beginning of the Neolithic especially is that lots of different things are being done. Things that were not done in the Paleolithic. They might have had weeding teams, I very much doubt it, but I don't think they would have had goat herds in the Paleolithic. I don't think many ditch diggers, unless Mark White can tell me that's not so. And there are lots of crafts as well, which are developing to do with building. The Neolithic is an age of building, and lots and lots of new crafts must have developed. These are things that have never been done before. And so there's a sense then of people creating their own identities through the development of new skills. The same is true perhaps less so for potting, since we now know there's a lot of forager pottery around, but it certainly did develop at the time of the Neolithic. And there are lots of other things going on. There might be 30 or so different sorts of skills, personal skills, which have developed at the beginning of farming. And this creates a huge range of potential combinations. And in small sites, where there may be only 10 or 20 people, I'd imagine that generalists would have developed who could do many of these things, but none particularly well. Whereas on larger sites, one can imagine the potential for developing specializations, for spotting people who are really good at thatching or really wonderful at cheese making, and their status would have changed in that way. So in the beginning of the Neolithic then, there's a whole range of new personal skills that creates different platforms for making persons. And this goes on in the Copper Age with lots of other things happening, lots of different mining skills, whether of flint or salt or copper, different ways of treating those materials, and other ancillary skills related to mining, but lots of other things as well. So another maybe 15, perhaps 20 new sets of skills then are developed in this period, which really means a complexification, a densification of skills in the social landscape that we're beginning to explore in ways that I think will be very profitable in the future. Now, just to conclude this section on personhood, I think it might be useful to look at what personal ornaments do. And this is, I think, very obvious to those of you who are wearing Gucci or Pandora ornaments. Looking around hard here, can't quite see. But it changes the very nature of the person by wearing ornaments. It provides them, in a very real sense, with a new identity. It offers them new perspectives, and it affords them a different sense of self. So wearing personal decorations, then, is another way of becoming a different sort of person. And this is really a study of style, the visual expression of cultural priorities, which is closely related to these aesthetics that I talked about a moment ago. And it's this aesthetic of colour and brilliance and exoticity that is an amazing development in these early periods, with the first major changes coming in the early Neolithic with farming, with a vastly increased range of colour in pottery and axes and ornaments, and a second major change with copper and gold metallurgy, which again were mostly used for ornaments. And the grades of polish then range from just an initial grinding for a smoothish surface to overall brilliance, which is absolutely dazzling, and we'll look at some examples of that in a moment. And while very often in the Balkans local materials were available and were sometimes used in a subsidiary way, wherever possible distant materials were preferred. People actively sought out the exotic rather than the local raw material for the same task. So we have this extraordinary range of exchange, which we'll document in just a moment. So what sort of ornaments then did the earliest farmers wear? Well, here's a wonderful example of an early farmer's house. And as you can see, the house has been turned into a human, it's been anthropomorphized, but it's also been turned into a decorated person. So you've got early signs then that houses were not only thought of as humans, but also decorated like humans, which is a wonderful idea. And then you have ornaments which make present in a very vivid way distant places. Here's a site from the Central Balkans, an ornament, a necklace which is made of polygorskite, a rock which is found only in the Urals or in Anatolia. So somehow, through thousands of kilometers, this material came to the Balkans, and whoever wore it then was connected somehow with this immense trading network. Very recently, a UCL archaeology thesis has demonstrated how early farmers were keen on the colour green and favoured ores that were green, that could produce green malachite, and they were also imitated then in fine polished stone, like this nephrite frog from the early Neolithic of South Bulgaria. So these are the kinds of things then that farmers were looking at. Whilst in the Copper Age, people created through the ornaments they wore links with either places or people, or in this case animals. Here we have, in the upper slide, a bracelet made of red deer canines. Now, only male red deer have canines, and they only have 2 each. And there's about 80 there. So unless they were extremely good dentists in the late Neolithic, we are talking about killing 40 red deer to make that bracelet. That's extraordinary, except that some of those are actually fakes. They're not real red deer canine. They're imitations of those made in bone. So people were cheating at a very early stage in the Copper Age. People also made personal ornaments from shells from a very long way away. So this turns up in the Varna Cemetery, which we'll come back to, but it's the shell was originally from the Aegean, and so we have this choice of colour here to emphasize the brightness. Also from the Varna Cemetery, there are many sheet copper ornaments which must have been fixed to clothes, lots of perforations here, and there are all kinds of interesting ways in which the cow and the calf are actually mathematically related. One could spin an interesting story here about geometry and proportions and harmony in creating these, but I won't go on to do that. But I will mention that at the same time as people were making sheet copper, they were also making sheet gold. They were also making cast gold bracelets of these very large ones on the left there, as well as collecting from the sea thousands of dentalium shells. In the richest dentalium grave at Varna, there are 9,000 or more dentalium shells, each collected in diving operations. So quite extraordinary presencing of different parts of the landscape as well as animals in the landscape. Okay, so we've got an idea then of how people made themselves. In Gordon Charles' famous, people were creating and making themselves. But this notion of personhood then is still on a quite small scale and a local scale. And I'd like to suggest to you how the people who were creating themselves, making themselves as persons, fitted into a really vast network that covered a good deal of Eurasia. And the early stage of this relates to indeed this spondylus shell that we've seen just now, which was traded from the Aegean across Europe in different ways, and that's a fully polished spondylus shell on the left there. So there's an early phase of exploitation of spondylus, which is limited just to the Balkans, but then it expands right the way across to Guernsey, and we now have a spondylus shell from Neolithic Sweden, so it's virtually the whole of Europe now. And then around 4800, and that's an important date that we'll remember for a moment, that's the end of the longest distance network, and it becomes a mostly Balkan and Southeast European network. So we've got these different things going on. Now this overlap, the tail end of the spondylus network, overlaps very much with another extraordinary thing, which is the development of trade in jadeite and copper. Now it's been a very long time since archaeologists knew that jadeite sources were limited, but no one had quite found out where they were. One of the places that was suspected was Monte Viso, high up in the southeast French Alps. And so there were sources of jade up there that we'll come to in a moment. And there are quarries at high altitude which produced roughouts of jade that were then polished, often for hundreds of hours. And these axes from Brittany, the longest, is about that long, and it took thousands of hours to polish this. It was an extraordinary feat of technical skill, and we still don't know what kind of abrasives were used. Now this main period of jadeite exploitation is more or less when the spondylus trade was changing, around 4800. And at the same time, again in the 5th millennium, copper mines started to be exploited both in central Bulgaria and northeast Serbia. And so we have this development of jadeite in the west, copper in the east. And it was as a result of a phenomenal research project led by Pierre Pétrequin, in which the EU funded him to the tune of 1.2 million euros. It was an 11-year project. One wished sometimes that we could have funding for 11 years to solve a really, really major problem. Pétrequin walked all the Alpine valleys and located all of the major jadeite sources. And his technique for analysis made it possible to trace individual jadeite axes to individual blocks of jadeite in the mountains. So there's a block of jadeite near Monte Viso, which has produced an axe deposited in Schleswig-Holstein, and another axe, the same rock, the same boulder, deposited in Brittany. That is phenomenal, the kind of work he's done. So to the east then we have the red dots for copper, the green dots to the west for jadeite, and in the middle there's an overlap zone in which people who made jadeite axes were imitating them in the form of copper axes and vice versa. So you've got this wonderful distribution that helps link the two parts of Europe. But they're not divided, in fact, because recently Pétrequin and his team have found jadeite axes from Monte Viso in Varna, in the Varna cemetery on the Black Sea coast. And another amazing find has come up. You saw this at the very beginning. This is a little gold pendant with a perforation and two small perforations, and an absolutely similar one has been found, made of sandstone, in a megalith, deposited in a megalith in Brittany, dated to 4600 BC, the same date as the Varna cemetery. So we've got this link then between Brittany, the southeast Alps, Varna, and in fact, if you look at the analyses of the copper ornaments found in the Volga basin at Khvalinsk, also dated to 4600 BC. You think I'm making it up, but I'm not, I promise. These copper objects come from the Ibunar copper mine that you saw in central Bulgaria. So around the middle of the 5th millennium then, we have got this immense network stretching from the Volga basin in the east to Brittany in the west. And all of this is at least 1500 years before the beginning of the Bronze Age. So we've got some extraordinary networks there. And that's the context then for the development of everything else I'm going to talk about. Probably quite a number of you know about the Varna Cemetery, which is the world's first great concentration of gold work, again with these mid-5th millennium dates. It was a Durham team with my wife Biserka and the Oxford radiocarbon lab that produced these first dates for the Varna cemetery. We've now got another 50. They're absolutely consistent. At Varna, there was a gendered core of male graves. There are no female graves in the richest part of the cemetery, so the males clearly kind of took ideological control, although the women held the power. And at the same time then, there's this extraordinary development of craft skills, which are materialized in, I've just got time to show you two examples. One of them is this amazing gold painted dish. The dish is this big, and it's painted with gold foil that's 0.003 millimeters thick. Extraordinary piece of work. But even more amazing are these carnelian beads. There's no source of carnelian in the Balkans. It might come from as far east as Afghanistan, but we're not quite sure. That's still not certain. But a Bulgarian gemologist spotted that these carnelian beads were faceted, and in some cases 16 facets on a tiny bead this long. And he also noticed that there were traces of the use of a lap wheel to produce the perforations of these carnelian beads. Now, the earliest previous knowledge of lap wheels was in the early Bronze Age of the Near East at Ur, around 3200 BC. This is 4500 BC. So we've got a real technological question of what's going on at Varna and its environs. So you've got these extraordinary finds, but at the same time, there are a large number of graves with no metalwork or hardly any metalwork at all, very few grave goods. So why did Varna develop where it did? And is it possible to interpret the cemetery not as a hierarchical social order, as some people have tried? Well, one very clear thing is that Varna on the Black Sea coast developed in an area where the mortuary domain was dominant for at least 700 years before it started. There's a long antecedent development then of mortuary behavior there. It was also a key node, more or less central to this Volga-Breton network, with lots of other interconnections too, and it was also near a rich salt source, whose chronology is still not certain. Here's a picture of the salt source with a tell. The tell goes, it's not that big a tell, it's not like the Josephine Butler barrow behind us, but oh, no. No. I'll just show you. The tell goes up to there, and the rest is a Roman barrow. And the other thing about the Varna cemetery is that there's a wide range of new materials which enhance the abilities of individuals to accumulate. So Varna then is like a library of biographies of objects and people. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why things have developed there. I think it's still, although people have tried to come up with non-hierarchical explanations, I don't find them very convincing. One person writing a DPhil at Oxford suggested that gold wasn't actually particularly special, it was just like flint or copper, or it wasn't really special, and for his temerity he was failed on his PhD, so he didn't get very far with that. I still remain to be convinced that we're not talking with some kind of pyramidal distribution. And the graves are like this. There are only 10 or 15 lavish graves, like the famous grave 43, with its gold penis sheath, out of place. There are dozens of rich graves with tens or hundreds of grave goods, perhaps patrons rather than paramount chiefs, and there are dozens of poor graves with no grave goods at all, perhaps clients. In other words, there is this pyramidal distribution, which to me suggests a strongly hierarchical pattern, and although there are many people who would dispute that now, I've yet to see a really convincing alternative. Okay, so we've got then this extraordinary Varna cemetery, and so far I've talked very much about about the quality of artifacts. But it's time now to change tack a little bit and talk about quantity and numbers and scale, and in particular, big is beautiful. I expect some of you are familiar with the work of Roy Lichtenstein, who has produced alternative versions, shall we say, of many great paintings. One of the alternative versions that he created was an alternative of the famous Van Gogh picture of the artist's bedroom. And Lichtenstein has admitted that, okay, his painting is much better, but mine is much bigger. You can see some wonderful sort of IKEA furniture there and lots of ordered paintings. So big certainly works sometimes, certainly for Lichtenstein. So if we look at this amazing development then in Eastern Europe, it's the obverse of Varna. There's Varna, but a bit further northeast is the Cucuteni-Tripolia distribution. And there are hardly any graves known at all. It's an almost total emphasis on settlements and houses rather than cemeteries and graves. There are very few metal objects. Most of the wealthy objects are made of fired clay, and they're mostly found in houses. That's an example of those. But what is surprising then about these settlements is that some are very large indeed. So one of the questions is, how can we explain the growth of these megasites? And can they be structured in any way except a hierarchical manner? And once again, like with Varna, where you have 700 years of prior development of cemeteries, here there are 2 millennia of settlement data. Starting off at the bottom in the A phase, with sites getting regularly larger, up to around 350 hectares. Now, 10 hectares may not sound a lot, but it's about half the size of the Durham Peninsula. 250 hectares is 10 or 12 times the size of the Durham Peninsula. So you can think about this. 6,000 years ago, sites as large as this were being created and developed. So in the west, the Cucuteni sites tend not to be much bigger than 10 or 15 hectares. And there tends to be this sort of pattern of house and garden complexes, with houses scattered across promontories like this, with not much planning. And this is very different then from the obvious concentric plans that are used in Tripolia, or as we say now in Ukrainian, Tripilia, subtle political emphasis. So what you find in Tripilia sites then is houses, houses and more houses. 1 or 2 roomed. Here's a reconstruction recently made in Ukraine, where everyday household practices are embedded in domestic ritual. And there's some examples then of what these houses might have looked like. And while some people argue that the houses might have been shrines, there's very little evidence until recently then that there were any public buildings, the kind of thing that would stand out in the Near East as something that might be connected to urban development. Well, the megasite project then started a couple of years ago, and we have had then an extraordinary development in methodology and beginning to lead to a conceptual revolution too. What we have in effect are elliptical structures with big vacant areas in the middle, but streets and indeed residential quarters based on standard planning. In 2009 we did a preliminary geophysical survey. These are 30 by 30 meter grids there, and I think you can see part of the long lines. Let's try this again, see if it works. No, it's still not working. But these long lines of buildings, there's the inner line Here's the outer line that will eventually go right round an oval. Now, Roland Fletcher looked at the sizes of settlements all around the world in terms of hunter-gatherer sites, farming sites, urban sites. And these Tropillia megasites are the only exception worldwide to his limits to agrarian settlement growth. They're much bigger than anything else anywhere in the world. And there's an interaction limit, which is how you get on with people in a certain area, how densely settled that is. And the Tropillia sites transcend the interaction limit. And also in terms of the larger the settlement, the harder it is to maintain communication. Tropillia also transcends the communication limit, the C limit of compact settlement. So there's clearly something very, very strange about these, and this was what led us to try to understand them. Now, in the 1980s, the Ukrainian researchers had produced some very, very good plans of almost complete megasites, but recent advances in geophysics have allowed us to produce much, much more detail. There's a 2012 version of that site from 1980, and if you blew that up, you'd be able to have plans of houses that are almost like excavation plans. They're extraordinarily detailed. And this is a plan that Durham University Archaeological Services produced last summer. It's our first major season for the new project. And what comes out is that Fletcher was looking at old plans when he was making his points about Tropillia sites. And what we can see now with the new plans is an amazing amount of spatial and social structuring in the megasites. And I'll just point out a few of these. We've actually got features embedded in the landscape here, paleochannels, and here we think that the line of the houses was changed to adjust to the paleochannel. In other words, the paleochannel was there before the houses. So we've got paleochannels. We've got ditches, which seem to go round part of the outside of the megastructure. We don't know what period they are, but we're going to excavate them next summer. We've got, just as we knew before, house clusters. That's not new, but they're much, much better defined. But now, for the first time, we have a number of pit clusters. That's just one little group of pits, but there are pit alignments and pit clusters, and we have to find out the relationship of those to the houses. And there's a good deal of bounded, unbuilt space between the two main lines of houses, and there must be some very interesting things going on there. And sometimes you actually get structures within that, very rarely, but sometimes. And most excitingly, you actually get ensemble of burnt houses, which are a bit like squares. Now, this is Nebelivka Square, with houses on four sides and pits inside. Again, we don't know the date of these and how that relates to the other houses, but that's part of the ongoing project. So all of this additional structuring, I think, will help us to understand Roland Fletcher's dilemma over the exceptional nature of these. But what we find also then, for the first time, is very large structures, which must be public buildings of some kind, on a megasite. And last summer, with immense hard work, and many thanks to all of the team. There are three of the team here this evening. I'm very pleased to acknowledge your hard work and those of everyone else. We managed to excavate almost in 6 weeks, plus or minus, a 30 by 20 metre megastructure, as we call it. And this is from Mark Household's kite photo. So what you have then is the outline of the walls in red. So you've got lots of walls on the east side, quite large open space in the middle, and other walls over in the the west side. And the features in purple, outlined in purple, are sort of permanent features. There's a podium raised above the ground, which is the largest podium known from Trypillia. There is a series of platforms in fired clay, the largest platforms ever known from Trypillia. And there's a fired clay bin with a grindstone in it, which is the largest fired clay bin ever found in Trypillia. So what you have here then are normal house type features and fittings, but of expanded size to be consonant with the size of the structure. What you do not have is amazing finds. National Geographic Society were doubtless bitterly disappointed that we didn't come up with a temple full of Gimbutas-like figurines. In fact, we found fewer figurines than we found on a house we excavated 3 seasons before. So there's something very, very interesting about a very large structure, but which doesn't have a sort of whiff of hierarchy about it at all. It's just a very large structure. It's very interesting. But, okay, at the same time, with thousands of people, certainly 1,000, maybe many thousands on the site, how do you get over the logistics of the provisioning? Whether it's water, was there any water management there? We're checking this out. Clay for potting must rapidly have exhausted local clay sources. Timber for building, for firewood, and for burning the houses, also a major source of problem for resources there. Lithic supplies, an estimated 2 tons a year. Arable land, the black earths of the Ukraine, the Chernozems, are amazingly fertile. But is there a limit to that fertility? No one's been able satisfactorily yet to answer that question. And finally, salt. Biseka, Gajdaska and I estimated the quantities of salt per annum for a similar sized megasite, Majdanetskoy, between 36 and 100,000 tons. So we're talking about massive logistical questions here for any of these. And that alone seems to me to suggest some kind of hierarchical development of organization for this. So I'm still very much the rump of a hierarchy modeler. Seems to me it's very hard to imagine the lack of a hierarchical component in either the Varna cemetery or the megasites. At Varna, it seems to me that a sumptuary component, a very special social component, is there, an elite lineage or elite persons, or perhaps both. Whereas in Trypillia then, the number of houses, the logistical problems, and the evidence for settlement pattern, I think all point in more or less the same direction. So, as yet, I would argue that hierarchy still rules. Okay. To conclude, one of the great 19th century historians of Vienna was very interested in things, and in that rather sardonic sort of Viennese way. Stifter thought that all things have a tale to tell, but he said the man, but indeed the person who listens shudders at it, for they speak of the general law, of the flowing of the present into the past. What I've hoped to be able to do today is to show you how we can follow that flowing of the present into the past by looking at lots of amazing things and some amazing structures too, and try to produce conclusions at which you don't necessarily all of the time shudder. Thank you very much.
I'm extremely grateful for John for his presentation and picking a few choice words, because we have a close to lavish reception for us. I'm really grateful for taking us through from Britain to the Volga, from taking us from micro beads to penis sheaths, as anticipated, I think, by many, and for really an exposure to John's colour, brilliance, and the exotic as well. So again, many congratulations. Thank you for speaking to us. For those of you who have questions for John, might I suggest that you interrupt him mid the refreshments? Thank you very much, and many congratulations again, John. Thank you.
Thanks very much.